Welcome to Boardroom Statecraft. I'm Ross Hill, and in each episode, we explore how global events, ideological shifts, and emerging threats are reshaping the environment in which companies operate. Hi everybody, welcome to this week's edition of Boardroom Statecraft. I'm Ross Hill, and with me as always this week is Dr. Tristan Wheat. Dr. Wheat, how are we getting on this week?
Pretty good. Not bad. Still in the thralls of the World Cup. Some upset victories like Ecuador over Germany. So we're gonna see how this plays out.
I'm pleased it's getting close to the knockout stage. Okay, so in the last week or so, a lot of political developments, and maybe we'll just get the UK out of the way because now I say this sort of quite a lot, and I started to say this tongue in cheek, and now it's become a bit more serious. But used to talk about Italy, everyone used to kind of joke at the number of kind of like failed prime ministers and successive governments, and the inability to do anything politically. But now, I used to joke a few years ago that the UK had sort of like become Italy, and that actually gets referenced by various different people. Not that I've said it, but it gets referenced that the UK is now Italy politically quite frequently in the media, because that's what it's starting to look like. But I mean, we said it a few weeks ago, although I don't think we claim it as any great feat of foresight that Starmer would resign. There was just no way that he was going to be able to continue based on the political scandals, based on the failure to pass any meaningful policy, based on his just general popularity overall, just meant that his days were numbered. And then as soon as Andy Burnham won the seat that he did, that enabled him to become a member of parliament, then that just kind of sped the process up. And now it looks like Burnham will walk in essentially as prime minister. I haven't seen anyone say that they're going to stand up and challenge him yet. Most people saying that they're going to actually support it. So that feels fairly certain now that within the next few weeks or so, Andy Burnham, if anyone doesn't know, long-time mayor of Manchester, a city in the north of the UK, will become prime minister. And I can't remember how many prime ministers we've had since about 2008 or whatever it is, but it's a fair few.
Yes, a fair few, because you had Gordon, Cameron, May, Johnson, Truss, Sunak, Starmer.
Yeah.
I might have missed
long
one.
list. Yeah. It's a pretty long list. I mean, I don't know what the average. I mean, Truss was obviously extremely short, but I don't know what the average. The average appears to be about 18 months or so at the moment. I mean, it's kind of interesting to me because it's true in the technical sense. I guess it's not true totally, but we elect a party, not a prime minister, essentially. So to continuously move through leadership changes says more about the system potentially than it actually does about the leader.
Well, I think that's one of the most important points of kind of why post-Brexit politics has been up in the air in the United Kingdom. And it's like, obviously Brexit has impacted a significant amount, but I would argue the bigger issues are the domestic systemic ones that are extraordinarily difficult to solve, but no prime minister has put forth solid ideas to actually solve them. And you and I have talked before about the decline in strong leaders, like capable leaders, even more so than strong, like capability to implement public policy. But you think about what the UK is facing: very, very sluggish GDP growth, No, like it's so hard to start new industries there. Productivity decline, housing pricing increases. The NHS is drastically underfunded. Um, and there are policies that could be implemented significantly. Like one of the things I truly don't understand about UK healthcare is the limitations on the number of doctors allowed into the system. That causes
Mhm.
so many more problems, I think. I understand
Yeah.
kind of why they're trying to control it, but like it's shocking to me how low the number is for those who are allowed to be admitted to medical school. That's an easy fix. Like you just get rid of the cap. Like and then in 5 to 10 years you would have solid improvement, especially because UK medical school isn't as long. Most doctors have what we would call physician assistant level education. So it's about 3 years compared to like the US, which is 4 and then a residency. So like UK medical school is a lot faster. So you could actually get a significant number more doctors because the bachelor system is shorter and then the doctoral system is shorter. So you could have a real impact even within 5 years, to be perfectly honest. And I'm just using this as an example. I'm not saying, I don't live in the UK. I know everyone has their policy preferences, but that's just like a policy idea to throw out. And yet you neither labor nor conservative, nor even to a certain extent reform have had like real policy ideas to solve these kinds of systemic issues. In the United Kingdom. And I think you're going to see that continuous turnover until you can have someone come in with real ideas and be able to start implementing them. But I think there's another part to it that we have to kind of remember historically. So, any longtime listener knows, Margaret Thatcher is one of my great heroes. Like, I really admire her. But a lot of people forget if it weren't for the Falklands War, she would have been out of power in 82, 83 at the latest. She
Mhm.
was deeply unpopular because she was implementing policies, but the kind of policies she was implementing, as with everything else, take time. And that's something that's kind of, anathema to politics is the understanding that
Yeah.
like these are big ships and you can't just turn them on a dime. But I agree with kind of your statement earlier where one of Starmer's problems is he didn't actually implement really any policy. Like there was no
Mhm.
major legislation that he could even turn to and be like, if you just give this time, making the argument that this could have a moderate impact or improve your life. And so going back to exactly what I think you're saying, no, I don't think it's about the individuals per se. It's parliament
Mhm.
is much more a party system, but the parties are failing. Like the parties are failing to produce any meaningful policy to deal with the deep systemic issues currently going on in the UK that have to be resolved if well, first of all, just to improve people's lives. Like that's the purpose of public policy. But if you want to stay in power as a party, you also need to implement those kind of policies.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I don't know. I essentially agree with what you're saying there. Um, and it's been a successive government issue. It's not purely just a Labour issue. Uh, and I think it's going to be very difficult for Burnham to also make any, significant changes within the next couple of years. Also, they will increasingly face calls to hold an election now,
Hmm.
as the Conservatives did every time they changed prime minister. That'll just be the nature of it. Um, but I think we're going to start to see Burnham probably is going to be probably more left wing than Starmer,
Hmm.
but within his own circles is accused of being somewhat populist,
Yeah, yeah,
uh,
yeah.
and so it's quite difficult to exactly understand where he might take things. He talks a lot about nationalisation. Given the current government financial conditions, I can't understand why that would be. a policy worth taking at the moment. But
Well,
regardless of that,
hold on for
also,
a
I don't know how
second.
popular.
So we can give like if for the Americans in our audience, because I know we have plenty of Brits listening who understand like a certain context. So
Mm,
the north of England is much more traditional and conservative than the south. So it's kind of the inverse of the United States. And so, of course,
hmm
a left wing politician from the north is significantly more likely to be populist. And so, like, for our American listeners, it would be akin to, a left wing politician in a major, Atlanta or Nashville who obviously is left wing, but has to have that populist streak in order to kind of be popular. And so I think understanding that sort of comparison will help people understand like how he would probably come in and implement sort of things from a policy perspective.
yeah, yeah. So, but we are in a sense because he hasn't been an MP. We can maybe look at some of the things he did as mayor of in
Hmm.
Manchester, but because he hasn't been an MP for quite some time, it's a little, and he hasn't held a significant ministerial position for quite some time. So it's quite difficult to exactly understand, uh, what he's going to do and what positions he's going to take. And this is actually one of the arguments of why Labour should throw up any kind of challenger to him
Mm.
would be in order for him to actually set out his policy positions on the number of different issues rather than just kind of walk in through an open door into a job where no one's exactly sure how he intends to change things, because I don't think anyone's exactly sure the direction the Labour Party is trying to take at the moment anyway. So and the greatest problem we have is that this just prolongs the instability and then the financial confidence in the UK, which is extremely important given our level of debt and borrowing.
Yep.
Markets have become a real crucial factor in British politics. And then certainly most of the people I've talked to have been people in the London area, so we're going to have quite a skewed
Yeah, yeah.
north south like divide in opinion on it. Uh, but there is not a great deal that I've heard. So this is just amongst my circle, so it's a very kind of like small sample. But it's just I haven't heard anybody speak that favorably of the changes.
Well, what I think is so because you and I do forecasting for a living on this kind of stuff. What I think is most likely to happen, Burnham comes in, nothing really happens. A general election is called. Reform gets about 30% of the vote. I'm actually expecting it to be about that. Um, and that primarily is because of the UK's first past the post voting. And so that's kind of a hard thing, because when you have multiple candidates, they just have to get, majority percentage,
Yeah,
not even 51. And so I think reform will get a solid minority vote. And then this is going to significantly increase the instability of parliament because what's going to be the alternative? Is it, a coalition government of the Tories, Labor, and Lib Dems? Like how is that going to work? Or are the conservatives going to work with reform? Which I think is entirely plausible, unlikely, but plausible because Badenoch
yeah,
might very well see the benefit of moving to the right on several issues, particularly immigration. And so, a conservative reform government, what would that actually look like? I think is an important sort of consideration because with the
yeah,
instability and then the constant feeling of nothing is being done, well, that's when people turn to like super populists and reform types, and I think it's incredibly likely that reform gets that kind of sizable minority based on polling and everything else going on. And then the general political atmosphere in the UK, especially some major, news items that have occurred in the last couple of months. If the election is held
yeah.
within the next year, I think that will still very much influence that kind of thing too.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think the the main point for me on this, and we've kind of said this a couple of times actually, is that Labour came in promising sort of some kind of political stability, and have clearly failed to achieve that for some of the reasons that we've already talked about today. And this change again appears unlikely to bring in that stability within the next period before the next election. And like you say, because of potential strong performance by reform, that then pushes political instability into the next what 7 to 10 years, which is that's a really long time.
Yeah.
Uh, um, and so it it's going to be politically here domestically. It's going to be a fairly rocky period for an extended period. I think is kind of where this is heading. I think I'd have felt that regardless of any personal opinion of Starmer or Labour, if they had been able to make the policy changes that they wanted, which even with a large majority they were unable to do, and if Starmer had remained as the PM for the entire term, um, then you might have felt like a modicum of stability was coming back. But that's just not the case. So we're in it for the long term here at the moment.
Yep. Not necessarily a good thing.
No, but I mean it. But then that follows the pattern of a lot of different places. If we think about how we talk about changing world order and the nature of geopolitics, I feel like it's all part of the same system to a certain extent, and it just impacts unevenly across the world, and you will feel it in different ways. And for the UK, we're feeling it in political stability for a lot of structural issues. Um, but nowhere is particularly immune. So I can kick it back over to the United States uh, for you
No.
uh, with
Yeah.
interesting developments there too.
No, like, because that's the thing, when, you and I have talked about analytically, like, the political developments, and, this past week, some Democratic socialists, more left-wing types won some key congressional primaries in New York, and they were backed by Mamdani, the left-wing mayor of New York City. And what's most interesting to me, again, because you and I approach this from like a forecasting aspect, is one, some of these candidates, particularly one who is like anti-prison, she's a quote unquote abolitionist, like believes in abolishing prisons, not just like abolish ICE, but like get rid of. And then when she's been questioned about it, she just talks about the trauma of prison. And then like, okay, but what's your policy idea? And the
Yeah.
reason I'm bringing that up is I think very similar to like the UK issue when the left wing does this kind of stuff. We saw the same thing with the defund the police kind of action or slogan that occurred in 2020 and a little bit beyond that. You have a right wing response, and I'm very much expecting this because the issues driving the primary politics for why far left candidates were chosen is understandable. Particularly Israel Palestine was a huge thing in those elections, and other sort of cultural issues. But if they win their elections, and they're likely to, because this is New York, and it's far more left wing than other parts of the country, stands like San Francisco or Seattle, um, then they are going to become the bait noirs used by the right to be able
Mm.
to push against like democratic politics. And I don't think the Democrats are considering how this is going to make it harder for them to win in 2028. Now, I think they're likely to win because of economics and other stuff. But, are they going to do as well as they potentially should have if, they don't have these like far left candidates who are you can use up as that kind of bait noir straw man argument of like, oh, the entire left believes that, which is not true, of
Yeah.
course. But welcome
Yeah.
to electoral politics where you just need one candidate who comes out and says, I believe in abolishing prisons. And then, the political ad is she wants murderers to come to your schools. Like that's like how that translates.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it's going to happen. And I just don't think the Democrats or the left in America have considered the actual politics of this playing out. And something I brought up with you that I think is interesting and related to this is a Gallup poll came out this month, and it showed that support for LGBT rights has declined in the United States, primarily amongst Republicans, but independents too. Democrats basically kind of held steady. But the fact that it declined with independents is really important. And I would argue that the main reason that this has kind of happened and then what it represents about politics writ large is the Republicans have been able to use the most extreme examples of whatever is going on, and in so doing have been able to turn the conversation. And so I think these are going to be relatively similar, where you have these far left candidates who are going to say far left things and not accurately, but the Republicans will use them as being representative of the left writ large. And I would forecast the left is going to have another backlash against them because of this kind of stuff in the US.
Yeah, that's really interesting because my thought on kind of, how it's gone with right-wing populism would be that actually what the mainstream parties might try and do would be come back to the center a little more. But actually that reverse seems to be true in that the popularity of right-wing populism has actually driven the left wing towards more left-wing populist policies or more. I don't know if extreme is exactly the right word. Those policies instead, and then that's with Mamdani in New York has suddenly become successful. So do you think that's part of a greater trend in the way the left will go? And then how effective or damaging will that be for both midterms and then the next presidential election?
Well, I think it's going to be very damaging for both the midterms and the presidential election. Because our primary system is like the difference between, say, like the UK or a lot of other places is we don't have a strong party system. We are not represented by parties. We are represented by very specific people. But our primary system gives the ability for a small group of people to influence politics much more significantly, because very few people actually vote in primaries. So this is why it was unsurprising that left-wing candidates or far left candidates
Okay.
would win, is because those are the people going and voting in the primaries, not the general election. Your moderates generally don't vote in the primaries, and that influences who gets chosen for this. But then when you hold up your two examples or your two party choices, because you're right that it's weird as an analytic perspective, but it's not weird when you understand like people
Yeah.
here and the way that like the
Yeah.
system
Yeah.
works, that the left would go further left because they're fighting within primary politics. They're not fighting in general election politics.
Mhm.
And then what I don't understand, because we're hardcore realists as analysts, is like then they're shocked that they don't do electorally well, and they
Yeah.
think a Mamdani style election is like, oh, Mamdani won in New York, basically this can happen anywhere in the US. No, it can't. New York City
Yeah.
politics are different, and
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
the mayoral race was really between a moderate Democrat and a left-wing Democrat, and the left-wing Democrat won. That's not how it's going to be that's not representative of US politics writ large.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of Democrats in particular, and then especially left-wing Democrats, like, turn a blind eye to that. It's baffling to me because even being here in DC, when you talk to like politicos, they don't seem to actually understand the voting behavior of people elsewhere. And I'm like, you're paid to have these insights, and yet you actually don't understand voting behavior and the way people make decisions. Whether you agree or disagree, that's completely different. People make all
Yeah.
kinds of decisions we dislike, but understanding their internal mechanisms is what's important. And I don't think the left wing, especially in the US, I don't think the left wing does. And then they're just shocked that the right wing is able to come up. And like, we can take this more broadly when we're thinking of politics and geopolitics. I think this is the reason the right wing is ascendant in Latin America. They have been very effective. Now these are close elections, Peru, Colombia, like very close elections, but the shocked nature of the left wing people there, where they're like, how could they possibly vote for Fujimori in Peru, or the right wing president in Colombia, or that's going to come in. And I want to turn to them and be like, do you not realize what's happening in your countries and how people are perceiving it? The security situation, the economic situation, that if you don't actually understand how people are living their lives and perceiving the environment around them and then make decisions, then you're not going to understand why Latin America is turning to the right as well. Like, this isn't just a UK thing or a US thing, that
Mhm.
this is happening in multiple places. And it's
Yeah.
because when you're given like these two options, you turn to the one that makes more sense to you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I I frequently find it interesting with people's decisions because so many people are kind of socially liberal,
Hmm.
but politically sort of conservative still. Um, but so I mean that in the sense of like you take a pretty liberal view on life when you talk
Hmm.
about LGBTQ rights and the kind of drop in support for that. But broadly, you know, I still find most people are socially liberal around that now. But still, when it comes to voting, they still tend to be a bit more politically conservative, which is why we had conservative governments here for such a long time. Yeah, I think people, for some, trusted conservative governments more than Labour governments for some reason. Uh, so, so yeah, understanding kind of like the nuances of kind of how people behave and then how they vote in the ballot box is not often exactly the same thing.
And not to be pedantic, but it's me. Um,
Yeah.
I think you're right. Most people are what we would generally kind of say personally liberal when it comes to,
Yeah.
my neighbor, my community, you do what you want. Like, I really don't care. I have to pay bills. I have to do my kind of thing. Um,
Hmm.
but this is where I think the left has failed, is if they were more liberal, they would be more popular. But they've abandoned liberalism for progressivism, is what we call it in the US.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And then taking on the moniker democratic socialist, etc. I think and I think the evidence bears this out. This isn't just like my, personal view of politics. This is, I think, if they were more liberal in the classical sense of liberalism in the 20th century, especially, where, you live your life the way you want to live your life, I live my life the way I want to live my
Yeah.
life. We're that's going to be our sort of social liberalism, is broad tolerance. And the
Yeah.
left moved from tolerance to imposition. And that's, like, I think, what the key change. And it's understandable because they want their own view of society to come through, but then they didn't understand that other people don't, and are going to push back against that too. Because I would argue, we're talking about this in the context of the political left. The political right had this happen a couple decades ago, where, because I agree with you, I think the majority of people, especially like here and in the UK, are that kind of personal liberal, where it's tolerant. You do your thing, I do my thing. I think the right had a backlash, and it's what led to the election of Obama. Multiple things led to that election, but like culturally, there was a major shift in the United States toward a much more liberal society. And I think it's because the right tried to do what the left is now trying to do, and the right tried to impose their vision of society, and society doesn't like that. And I
No.
know that's sort of an amorphous term, but society is inherently organic, and it's those sort of social engineering impositions that people tend to rebel against. And so I think we saw that against the right in the late 90s and 2000s. America moved very much politically, socially and politically liberal, and then the left took that as like, oh, we can now impose our think, and then it's being pushed this way. And when it's significantly more organic, I think most people have that kind of personal liberalism you're talking about.
Mm, mm. And it does start to, of course, then come into the way corporations behave on
Hmm.
many different levels. But I think the a reasonably relevant example would be, well, two things, I suppose. So ESG, which it doesn't have the same presence that it did a few years ago. Everything was becoming ESG related. Uh, but as geopolitics has changed and the perception of stability of the global order and then political stability and economic stability has changed, as a priority, ESG seems to have lowered, and I'll talk about this in a second, at least in a public facing sense. And then the same with DEI, and this is particularly for the US. And after, Trump started his second term, a lot of companies pretty much, again, somewhat publicly abandoning DEI programs. When you talk to people, the reality of what that means may not be exactly the same. They companies may still operate DEI style programs, should we call it. They're just not
Yeah.
publicly talking about it. And then they may operate, with ESG frameworks, although maybe they're not exactly publicly talking about it. So it's not like those things just disappear completely, but because of the way attitudes and society changes, businesses will shape the way they behave because public perception is obviously important to them.
No, I think that's a great, example, because obviously we focus on how politics and geopolitics impacts corporations. And my example before of when the right tried to impose, you saw corporations basically siding with like the liberal society. And then after, the imposition started, and corporations were a key part of that. Like, let's have an honest conversation, where I think they're a key reason the right wing populists started rising up is because people are like, this is happening in my workplace. Screw this. Like, I'm not happy. I'm going to go vote to make this change, because even corporations have joined on the imposition part of it. And then after the ascendancy of the right and the hatred of that kind of imposition, corporations have said, "Oh, we actually have to move to not
Mm.
necessarily the other side, but back to that kind of social liberalism of, okay, everyone just kind of do their thing. You bring yourself to work, but we're not going to impose whatever kind of order we have that general tolerance." And so corporations get caught up into the broader political actions and conversations. And I would argue it's not necessarily beneficial to them to try to pick sides when those
Hmm.
things are occurring. because the about face that corporations had to do with ESG and DEI after the second Trump administration was whiplash. And then it alienated a whole bunch on the political left because of that whiplash. And that's understandable. They were like, the political left was like, we thought you were on our side, and now you're just doing whatever is salient to you. And if they had taken that much more sort of hands-off approach, I think they could have weathered that significantly better.
Yeah, but as we know, the pressure that
Yeah.
companies and then particularly their top executives face now to pick that side, make that statement, set out their belief system,
Hmm.
because it runs through all of their stakeholders now. Stakeholders are choosing, do I buy a product from you? Do I work for you? Do I support you? Based on, it's not just because they think that that company is going to give them a great job or a great product. It's also based on it's shared values, perception of shared values, as a consumer or employee or whatever stakeholder you are, and so I think, based on our conversation, again, that's something that's not going away.
Hmm.
We've been monitoring it for some time now. It's been happening for some time, and it's not going away. And then, in other conversations, won't have time to talk about it today. We talk about the kind of threats that actually brings to corporations. But now, because of the changing threat environment, how quickly those threats come from, a digital world to a physical kind of reality. We've had the Pathfinder IPSB sort of joint conference in London this week, and that was one of the topics of, conversation, obviously, because executive protection, linked conference. And so that formed one of the sessions and a lot of conversations that we've been having about how do we deal with this? But based on the political environment that we're seeing, that again is here to stay.
Yep, I completely agree with that. Everything we're talking about is hard, because, you know, my statement just a moment ago, I may say over the long term, it's better to take a more neutral position, but that doesn't help you with the oscillations and difficulties quarter to quarter and year to year of trying to manage the politics of being in business.
Yeah, that's for sure. Okay, thanks, Tristan. Appreciate that. Enjoyed that conversation. I hope everybody else enjoyed it too. And we hope you join us again next week. Goodbye, everybody. You have been listening to Boardroom Statecraft by Insight Forward. Music for this episode is by @BarelySentient on Suno. You can follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and TikTok, and find out more about us at insightforward.co.uk.